Londa had a back that told a story. It was a back permanently curved from 27 years of leaning over a wheelchair, lifting a growing man, and carrying the physical weight of a life the world had written off. For nearly 3 decades, those vertebrae had endured more strain, and her knees had survived more sleepless nights of pacing than any mother in the city could claim. She had poured her very life force into a family that viewed her as little more than a necessary piece of medical equipment, a human crutch to be hidden in the servants' quarters. And on the very day she expected a miracle to be met with a celebration, those same aching joints carried her meager belongings through the iron gates as the family pointed her toward the street like an old, rusted machine that was no longer required. But what the Sterling family did not realize was that the man now standing on his own 2 feet was watching. And he remembered every single moment. Londa was nearly 60 years old, and she had spent almost half her life within the cold, silent stone walls of the Sterling Manor. She had arrived as a young woman of 32, desperate for work after the world had taken everything else from her. The Sterlings were among the wealthiest families in the country. Mr. Sterling was a ruthless financier whose influence spanned continents. His wife was a woman of sharp angles and expensive silks who looked at those beneath her as if they were stains on her marble floors. They had one son, Oscar, who was born into a body that refused to obey him. From the very first night Londa entered the nursery, it was clear that the Sterlings had no interest in the messy, painful reality of a special needs child. They wanted a perfect heir to display at charity galas, not a boy who needed to be carried through the dark hours of the night. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling Manor did not just keep the world out. They seemed designed to swallow the sounds of life within. Londa remembered the day she first walked through them, clutching a single suitcase and a heart that had been hollowed out by her own grief. The air inside was chilled, smelling of expensive wax and a sterile, suffocating silence. She had been hired not as a nurse or a teacher, but as a custodian of the inevitable. In the grand sun-drenched nursery that felt more like a gallery than a child's room, she found 8-month-old Oscar. He was a beautiful boy with eyes like dark velvet, but he lay too still. The specialists had just left, their leather briefcases filled with charts and grim certainties. The diagnosis was a cold, clinical sentence. Oscar would never walk. To the Sterlings, who measured human value in agility, power, and social standing, their son had become a broken inheritance before he could even crawl. Londa's first task was to sit. She sat by the crib as the sun dipped below the horizon, watching the shadows of the ornate window bars stretch across the floor like the teeth of a trap. She expected the click of heels, the rustle of silk, or the heavy tread of a father coming to check on his child after such devastating news. But the hallway remained a vacuum. Mrs. Sterling had retreated to the East Wing to recover her nerves, and Mr. Sterling had already returned to the city, his grief expressed only through the aggressive signing of checks to cover Londa's salary. "It's just you and me, little bird," Londa whispered, her voice a raspy comfort in the gloom. She reached out and touched Oscar's small, limp foot. It was soft, perfect, and utterly unresponsive. She felt a surge of a familiar, protective ache, the kind that only a woman who has lost everything can feel for a child who has been given everything but love. As the weeks bled into months, the nursery became a forgotten island. The Sterlings' visits, initially brief and stiff, dwindled into non-existence. They could not bear the sight of the wheelchair that arrived when Oscar turned 2, a gleaming, motorized reminder of their perceived failure. To them, the chair was a cage. To Londa, it was simply where her boy lived. She watched from the upstairs window as Mrs. Sterling hosted garden parties below, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass, never once glancing up toward the room where her son sat. Londa's back began its long, slow curve during those early years. She refused to let Oscar spend his days staring at the ceiling. She lifted him, her muscles learning the specific gravity of his growing frame, moving him from the bed to the chair, from the chair to the floor and back again. She became his legs before he even understood he was missing them. While the parents sought to distance themselves from the problem, Londa leaned into it. She memorized the way his eyes brightened when she hummed, the specific tilt of his head when he was curious, and the heavy, frustrated sighs he let out when his body failed his spirit. In that silent wing of the house, a secret world was formed. The Sterlings had paid for a servant to manage a tragedy, but they had accidentally invited in a mother. Londa looked at Oscar's unmoving legs and didn't see a diagnosis. She saw a foundation. If the world would not come to him, she would carry him to the world, even if she had to do it one painful step at a time, hidden in the shadows of a house that had already said its goodbyes. The moon was often the only witness to the real work being done in the Sterling manor. While the rest of the house lay in the heavy, expensive sleep of those who had no burdens to carry, Londa would begin her nightly ritual. She would wait until the last flickers of light vanished from under the master bedroom door before she moved Oscar from his bed to the thick, plush rug in the center of the nursery. This was their sanctuary, a secret gym where the clinical never of the doctors was systematically dismantled by the quiet maybe of a woman who refused to listen to them. For years, this was the rhythm of their lives. Londa would sit on the floor, her own joints protesting with every movement, and take Oscar's small, heavy legs into her lap. She moved them with a rhythmic, tireless grace, flexing the ankles, rotating the knees, and stretching the muscles that the world assumed were useless. She spoke to his limbs as if they were sleeping children, whispering encouragement into the stillness. "Wake up," she would murmur, her hands warm against his cool skin. "You have places to go. You have a world to see that isn't through a window." Oscar grew and the work grew harder. As he moved from a toddler to a young boy, his body became a greater weight to manage, but Londa's resolve only hardened. She had spent a decade turning her own back into a crane and her arms into iron. She didn't just move his body, she taught him to feel it. She would place his feet against her chest so he could feel the vibration of her heartbeat, or press them against the cold floor so he could understand the concept of ground. While his parents were busy curating their social calendars and mourning the son they thought they lacked, Londa was busy building the man he was becoming. There were nights of profound frustration, where Oscar's dark eyes would fill with tears of exhaustion, and his body would remain as unresponsive as stone. In those moments, when the silence of the house felt like a mocking laugh, Londa would simply pull him into her lap and hold him. She was the only person who saw the fire behind his stillness, the only one who didn't look at the wheelchair and see an end. She treated his legs not as broken ornaments, but as dormant seeds. She invested in books on anatomy and physical therapy with the meager wages the Sterlings thought she was spending on herself. She learned the names of every tendon and the pathway of every nerve. In the dark, she became a master of a craft no one knew she was practicing. Every night was a grueling marathon of repetition, thousands of cycles of movement that showed no immediate result to an outside observer. To the Sterlings, who occasionally caught a glimpse of them during the day, Londa was just a maid performing a chore. They didn't see the sweat on her brow in the moonlight or the way she was pouring her own vitality into Oscar's nervous system. By the time Oscar was a teenager, the secret gym had become a place of intense, focused labor. Londa had rigged up silken pulleys from the sturdy bedposts, helping him find the leverage to move his own weight. She was no longer just his legs. She was his coach, his believer, and his private army. "They think you are a statue, Oscar," she told him one night, her voice low and fierce. "But statues don't have hearts like yours. You are a mountain waiting for the right moment to move. And in the quiet of the 2 a.m. hour, as she felt a microscopic flicker of resistance in his right calf, Londa knew that the years of silence had not been empty. The house was asleep, but inside Oscar, something was finally waking up. The seasons in the Sterling manor were marked not by the weather, but by the invitations that fluttered into the foyer like confetti. When the gala season arrived, the house transformed into a stage of glittering glass and forced laughter. Mrs. Sterling moved through the halls like a polished blade, her eyes scanning for any imperfection that might mar her carefully curated image. To her, the most significant imperfection was the boy in the West Wing. During these weeks, Londa's primary directive from the mistress was clear, though it was never spoken in plain words. Keep the boy invisible. Londa would hear the gravel crunching under the tires of expensive cars and the first tinkling notes of a jazz quartet echoing up the grand staircase. Downstairs, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Upstairs, it was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of a life on standby. Mrs. Sterling would occasionally breeze into the nursery before her guests arrived, not to kiss her son, but to inspect the perimeter. She would stand in the doorway, her silk gown shimmering under the chandelier, and cast a long, cold shadow over Oscar's wheelchair. Her glances were never filled with the warmth of a mother, but with a sharp, stinging embarrassment, as if Oscar were a broken piece of furniture that couldn't be moved to the attic. "Ensure he remains in this wing, Londa," she would say, her voice as thin and cold as a wire. "The noise downstairs will only agitate him. It's for his own comfort." Londa would nod, her hands tightening on the back of Oscar's chair, shielding him from the frost of his mother's gaze. She knew the lie for what it was. It wasn't Oscar's comfort that was at stake. It was his mother's vanity. Every time Mrs. Sterling looked at Oscar, she didn't see the boy who had spent hours practicing his grip or the young man who was beginning to find his voice. She saw a flaw in her perfect narrative of a charmed life. She saw a special need that she couldn't shop away or delegate to a committee. As the music swelled below, Londa would turn the nursery into a fortress of quiet dignity. She would close the heavy curtains to block out the flashing lights of the paparazzi at the gate and put on a small radio, playing the soft melodies Oscar loved. She would sit on the edge of his bed, showing him books about the stars or the deep ocean, places where the rules of the Sterling world didn't apply. Oscar would watch the door, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering light of the radio dial, listening to the muffled sounds of the parents who forgot he existed the moment a camera flash went off. There were moments when Oscar would reach out, his hand trembling with the effort of a movement they had practiced for months in the dark, and point toward the hallway. Londa would take his hand in hers, her weathered skin a stark contrast to his youth, and squeeze it gently. "They are playing a game down there, Oscar," she would whisper. "A game of masks and mirrors. You don't need to be part of it. Your strength is real. Theirs is just paper." She protected him not just from the guests' prying eyes, but from the soul-crushing weight of being a secret. When the laughter from the garden became too loud, or when he caught a glimpse of his mother laughing with a stranger in a way she never laughed with him, Londa would position herself between him and the door. She became his human shield, a wall of domestic labor and fierce love that kept the shame of the socialite from reaching the heart of the son. In those long, glittering nights, Londa wasn't just a maid. She was the keeper of a dignity that the Sterlings had discarded, waiting for the day when the boy they hid away would finally stand in a light they couldn't control. The years had a way of blurring together in the quiet isolation of the West Wing, marked only by the deepening lines on Londa's face and the steady, quiet strength growing in Oscar's chest. He was no longer the small boy she had to cradle against her shoulder. He was a man of 26, with shoulders broadened by years of pulley work and a mind as sharp as the polished silver downstairs. Yet, to the rest of the manor, he remained a static figure, a permanent fixture of the room like the heavy velvet drapes that never seemed to open. It was a Tuesday in November, a night like any other, when the silence was finally broken. The grand clock in the foyer had long since chimed 3 a.m., and the house was submerged in that heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes the dawn. Londa was on the floor, her hands, now gnarled with the beginning of arthritis, wrapped around Oscar's right foot. She was performing the same stretches she had done thousands of times before, her eyes half closed in a trance of muscle memory and weary devotion. She was whispering a story about a mountain that decided to walk to the sea when she felt it. It wasn't a large movement, not a kick or a lunge, but a microscopic electric twitch. The big toe on Oscar's right foot had shivered against the palm of her hand. Londa froze. Her breath hitched in her throat, a jagged sound that seemed too loud for the room. She didn't dare move, fearing that even a heartbeat might shatter the moment. She waited, her eyes locked on that single point of contact, her thumb pressing slightly firmer against the skin. "Oscar," she breathed, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "Again. Try again." In the dim light of the single bedside lamp, she saw the muscles in Oscar's neck cord with a sudden, violent effort. His face, usually a mask of calm patience, contorted with a focus so intense it looked like pain. And then it happened. The toe didn't just twitch. It curled. A deliberate, intentional movement that defied 26 years of medical certainty. Londa didn't shout. She couldn't. Instead, a single, hot tear escaped her eye and splashed onto Oscar's ankle. Then came another and another, until she was weeping silently, her forehead resting against his shin. These were not the tears of grief she had carried when she first arrived at the manor. They were the tears of a woman who had spent half her life shouting into a void and finally heard an echo. "You felt it?" Oscar whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had never allowed himself to voice. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that the wall between them and the rest of the world had finally developed a crack. Londa looked up, her face wet and glowing in the amber light. She squeezed his foot, her hands trembling. "I felt it, my bird. The journey has begun." She knew exactly what this meant. The years of secret gym sessions, the hidden anatomy books, and the midnight pulley work were no longer just a way to pass the time in a lonely house. They were a fuse that had finally been lit. As she sat there in the dark, she didn't see the wheelchair in the corner or the expensive, cold manor that surrounded them. She saw a path leading out of the West Wing. She saw the end of the silence. The Sterlings were asleep in their silk sheets, dreaming of their social standing and their perfect, polished lives, unaware that the flaw they had hidden away had just found his pulse. Londa wiped her eyes with her stained apron, her back straightening with a newfound purpose that eclipsed the ache in her joints. The miracle had arrived, not with a trumpet blast or a gala celebration, but in the shivering of a single toe in the dead of night. The work was far from over, but for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Londa wasn't just holding a child who wasn't hers. She was holding a future. The moon hung low and heavy over the Sterling estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the nursery floor that seemed to vibrate with a new, restless energy. It had been months since that first electric tremor in Oscar's toe, months of grueling, silent labor that had pushed both Londa and Oscar to the edge of their endurance. Tonight, the air in the West Wing felt different, charged, like the moment before a summer storm breaks the heat. Londa moved with the practiced quiet of a ghost, her weathered hands steady as she helped Oscar transition from his chair to the edge of the bed. They didn't need words anymore. A look, a slight shift in his weight, and she knew exactly where the strength was failing and where the fire was catching. For 27 years, she had been his skeleton, but tonight, Oscar's own frame seemed to hum with a defiance that made the very floorboards feel unsteady. "Today is the day, little bird," Londa whispered, her voice a rough melody against the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "The mountain doesn't just move, it rises." Oscar's face was pale in the moonlight, his features sharpened by a focus so absolute it bordered on the divine. He looked at his feet, planted firmly on the plush rug, and then up at Londa. He didn't reach for her shoulders for balance as he usually did. Instead, he gripped the edge of the mahogany bed frame, his knuckles turning white. The silence of the house was a physical weight, the Sterlings dreaming their distant dreams in the other wing, oblivious to the revolution occurring in their own home. Londa stood inches away, her arms out, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a safety net made of scars and devotion, waiting for the moment the impossible became real. With a low, guttural groan that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones, Oscar pushed. Londa watched as the muscles in his thighs, the ones she had massaged every night for a decade, corded and shook. His knees, once as fluid as water, locked into place with a sickening, wonderful snap. Inch by agonizing inch, Oscar's head rose. He bypassed the height of the wheelchair, then the height of the headboard until he was looking Londa directly in the eye from a vantage point he had never known. For the first time in 27 years, Oscar was standing. He swayed, his breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps, his body a skyscraper built on a fault line. Londa didn't move to catch him immediately. She let him feel the glorious, terrifying ache of gravity. She let him feel the floor pushing back against him. The moonlight hit his face, illuminating a look of such pure, raw triumph that Londa felt her own knees begin to weaken. I'm standing," he wheezed, the words a miracle in themselves. Londa finally stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist as he leaned his weight into her. They stood there in the center of the room, a pillar of two lives fused into one. Oscar buried his face in Londa's shoulder, his tears hot and fast against her stained apron. She held him with a ferocity that defied her age, her own tears blurring the sight of the empty wheelchair that sat in the corner like a discarded shell. In that cold, silent manner, surrounded by the expensive things of people who did not love them, they held their secret victory. The special needs son was no longer a stationary object to be hidden. He was a man who had conquered his own shadow. Londa stroked his hair, her gnarled fingers trembling. They had no audience, no applause, and no recognition from the parents downstairs. But as the moonlight bathed them in silver, Londa knew they had already won. The world outside might not know it yet, but the cage had been broken from the inside out. The morning following the midnight miracle did not bring the celebration Londa had envisioned in her weary, hopeful heart. Instead, the manor felt colder than usual, the air brittle with a tension that radiated from the master suite. Oscar had spent the early hours practicing his balance, his face alight with a quiet, fierce joy that Londa had shielded like a candle flame in a gale. But when the heavy footsteps of Mr. Sterling echoed down the hallway, accompanied by the sharp, rhythmic click of his wife's heels, the joy was instantly replaced by a looming dread. They didn't come to the nursery to embrace their son. They stood in the doorway, watching from a distance as Oscar, determined to show them the fruit of 27 years of labor, gripped the back of a chair and pulled himself upright. He stood before them, swaying slightly but tall, his eyes searching theirs for a flicker of the pride he had earned. Mrs. Sterling did not smile. She did not gasp in wonder. Instead, her face paled, her lips thinning into a hard, defensive line. She looked at Oscar's standing form not as a miracle, but as a confrontation. To her, this was a sudden, jarring shift in the narrative she had controlled for nearly 3 decades. If Oscar was no longer the broken child hidden in the West Wing, then the entire structure of her life, her excuses for her distance, her curated image of tragic resilience, was under threat. Most of all, she looked at Londa, who stood at Oscar's side, and saw the architect of a truth she wasn't ready to face. "Londa," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping into the deep, transactional tone he used for boardroom dismissals. "A word in the study. Now." The study was a room of dark wood and leather, smelling of old paper and indifference. Mr. Sterling sat behind his massive desk, while his wife stood by the window, her back turned to the room as if she couldn't bear to breathe the same air as the help. Londa stood on the Persian rug, her hands tucked into the pockets of her stained apron, her heart sinking with every passing second of silence. "We've seen the progress Oscar has made," Mr. Sterling began, tapping a gold pen against a mahogany surface. "It is unexpected. However, now that he is entering this new phase of recovery, we've decided that the current arrangement is no longer suitable." Londa felt a chill crawl up her curved spine. "Sir, you were hired to manage a specific set of circumstances." "Londa," Mrs. Sterling interrupted, turning around with a look of practiced detachment. "But Oscar is a man now. He needs modern, professional rehabilitation. A specialized team. Your methods are dated, emotional. Frankly, you've become a living reminder of a time we are ready to move past." The words hit Londa with the force of a physical blow. 27 years of lifting, of secret midnight pulleys, of crying in the dark, and of being the only person who believed in a pulse. All of it was being reduced to a dated method that was no longer required. They weren't firing her because she had failed. They were firing her because she had succeeded too well. She had made Oscar visible, and in doing so, she had made their neglect undeniable. "I have looked after him since he was a baby," Londa whispered, her voice trembling. "He needs me. He needs a fresh start," Mr. Sterling said, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "This is your severance. It is more than generous. We've arranged for a car to take you to the station in an hour. We've already hired a new staff of attendants who will be arriving shortly. It's best for Oscar if the transition is quick. No scenes." Londa looked at the envelope, then at the people who had given Oscar life but never a home. She realized then that to them, she was just like the wheelchair Oscar no longer needed, a tool to be discarded once its utility had passed. Her 27 years of love were being settled like a common debt. As she turned to leave the room, her back felt heavier than it ever had when she was carrying Oscar. The betrayal was complete. She had given him the world, and for that, his parents were taking hers away. The walk from the West Wing to the service entrance had never felt so long, nor the small burlap bag in Londa's hand so heavy. Inside were the only things she truly owned: a few faded photographs of her own lost family, a worn prayer book, and a small wooden bird Oscar had carved for her with his trembling hands when he was 12. 27 years of a life, compressed into a bundle that weighed less than a gallon of milk. She didn't go back to the nursery. The new attendants had already arrived. Efficient, uniformed men with cold eyes and digital clipboards who moved into the room like a tactical team. They had blocked the doorway, their broad shoulders forming a human wall between her and the boy she had raised. She could hear Oscar's voice rising in a confused, frantic pitch behind them, calling her name, but the heavy oak door had swung shut with a finality that echoed in her very marrow. The gravel of the long driveway crunched under her sensible shoes, a rhythmic, lonely sound that seemed to mark the seconds of her exile. As she approached the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate, The sun began its slow descent, bleeding a deep, bruised orange across the horizon. It was the golden hour, the time of day that usually brought a sense of peace to the manor, but tonight the light felt predatory. It caught the tears tracking through the deep lines of Londa's face, illuminating her grief in a cinematic glow that she didn't want and couldn't hide. The shadow of the ornate gate stretched out before her like a set of bars. She stopped for a moment, her breath hitching in a chest that felt tight with a physical ache. She turned back to look at the stone manor one last time. From this distance, it looked like a fortress, cold and impenetrable. In a high window of the west wing, she thought she saw a silhouette. A man standing tall, his hands pressed against the glass. A sharp, impatient honk from a black sedan waiting by the curb startled her. The driver, hired by Mr. Sterling to ensure her efficient departure, stared at her with the blank indifference of a man watching a clock. Londa gripped the neck of her burlap bag, her knuckles white and shaking. She felt a sudden, terrifying surge of vertigo. Where did a woman go when the only person who needed her had been placed behind a locked door? What happened to the shadow when the body it followed was suddenly wrenched away? She stepped through the gates, the iron clanging shut behind her with a sound that vibrated through the pavement and up into her tired bones. The golden hour cast her long, distorted shadow toward the street, making her look like a giant while she felt smaller than she ever had in her 60 years. She was a stranger now, a weathered woman in a stained apron standing on the edge of a world that had used up her youth and discarded her at the moment of her greatest triumph. She didn't look at the envelope of money tucked into her pocket. No amount of paper could compensate for the 27 years of midnight lullabies and secret pulleys. As the car pulled away, Londa kept her eyes fixed on the burlap bag in her lap. She clutched the wooden bird inside, its carved wings a silent promise in the falling dark. She was leaving her heart behind in that stone manor, but as the golden light finally faded into gray, she whispered a prayer to the stillness. She had taught Oscar how to stand. Now, she had to trust that she had taught him how to fight. The Sterling Manor was ablaze with a light that felt clinical rather than celebratory. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal hurricane lamps, and the scent of expensive lilies was so thick it seemed to choke the very air out of the grand ballroom. It was the night of the Victory Gala, a title Mrs. Sterling had selected with the same cold precision she used to choose her jewelry. To the elite of the city, the evening was a celebration of a medical miracle. To Oscar, it was a funeral for the life he had known. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, his legs encased in the sharp, charcoal fabric of a tailored suit that felt like armor. The new attendants stood just a few paces behind him, their presence a silent reminder of the transition his parents had forced. For the guests below, Oscar was the star of a play they had all paid to see, the broken heir who had finally been fixed. But as he looked down at the sea of shimmering gowns and practiced smiles, Oscar felt a profound, hollow ache. His gaze drifted to the corner of the ballroom, where a single gilded chair had been placed under a spotlight. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, ornate and stiff, intended for him to sit in should his new strength fail. But beside it, barely tucked into the shadows of a velvet curtain, sat his old wheelchair. The staff had intended to move it to the basement, but Oscar had insisted it stay. Now, looking at the worn leather seat and the scuffed metal of the footrests, he realized a crushing truth. That chair, with all its limitations and its heavy, functional honesty, had held more love than the entire gilded room combined. The wheelchair had been the site of his and Londa's greatest victories. It was where she had whispered secrets to him, where she had massaged his tired muscles, and where they had plotted a future that didn't involve hiding. Downstairs, his mother was holding court. She looked radiant, her laughter floating up to him like the tinkling of ice in a glass. She was telling a group of captivated listeners about the rigorous journey of Oscar's recovery, painting a picture of parental devotion that was as beautiful as it was fraudulent. She spoke of late nights and specialized treatments, conveniently omitting the woman in the stained apron who had actually done the work. Oscar felt a sudden, violent surge of vertigo. The polished world his parents occupied, a world of reputations, appearances, and strategic silences, felt like a cage far more restrictive than any physical disability. In his wheelchair, he had been invisible, but he had been real. Standing here under the heat of the chandeliers, he felt like a ghost in a well-dressed corpse. He began the long, slow descent down the stairs. Every step was a testament to Londa's hands, yet every person who cheered for him saw only the sterling success. He reached the bottom and was immediately surrounded by strangers who smelled of gin and old money, clapping him on the back and calling him a warrior. "You must be so proud of your parents," a woman cooed, her diamonds catching the light. "They never gave up on you." Oscar looked past her, his eyes finding the empty chair in the spotlight. He realized then that the miracle wasn't that he could walk. The miracle was that he had been raised by a woman who taught him how to see through the glitter. He looked at his father, who was raising a crystal flute in a toast to the sterling legacy, and then at his mother, who was adjusting her hair in a nearby mirror, and he knew what he had to do. The wheelchair wasn't a symbol of what he had lost. It was a reminder of who had truly stood by him. The gala was a lie, and the manor was a tomb. If he was going to use the legs Londa had given him, he wasn't going to use them to stand in a cage. He was going to use them to walk out of it. The city beyond the sterling gates was a chaotic, indifferent place, but Londa had found a sliver of peace in a small, rented room on the edge of the industrial district. It was a modest space where the walls didn't whisper with judgment and the air didn't smell of cold marble. She had spent her severance not on luxury, but on a small garden plot and a sturdy wooden chair she placed by the window. She sat there every evening, her gnarled hands resting in her lap, watching the sunset and wondering if the man she had taught to stand was still upright in a world that wanted him to bow. She was tending to a wilting geranium on her windowsill when the sound of a car, not a sleek, silent sterling sedan, but a practical, humming vehicle, stopped at the curb. The door opened, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A man stepped out. He didn't wait for an attendant to open his door, and he didn't reach for a cane. He walked with a slight, rhythmic hitch in his gait, a testament to 27 years of gravity and one woman's refusal to give up. It was Oscar. Londa's breath caught, her hand trembling against the flower pot. She didn't move as he navigated the uneven pavement of the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on her window with a fierce, unwavering light. When he reached her door, he didn't knock. He simply pushed it open and stood there, filling the small room with a presence that the sterling manor could never contain. "You left your bird behind, Londa," he said, his voice thick with a warmth that broke the last of her defenses. He held out the small wooden carving she had left in her haste, his grip firm and sure. Londa stood, her knees popping in the quiet room, and for the first time in her life, she didn't look at him as a servant looks at a master. She looked at him as a mother looks at a miracle. "Oscar," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here. Your parents." "My parents have a manor and a legacy," Oscar interrupted, stepping toward her with the strength she had breathed into his lungs. "But they don't have a son. Not anymore. I walked out of that gala, Londa. I walked out of the inheritance, the name, and the cage. I realized that standing on my own 2 feet didn't mean anything if I was standing in a lie." He took her weathered hands in his youth and her age meeting in a grip that felt like a closed circuit. I've spent the last few weeks building something. It's not a manor. It's a home. It's small and the floors are level, and there isn't a single servant's entrance. I want you to come home, Londa. Not to work, but to live. The move was quiet, a stark contrast to the dramatic expulsion weeks prior. Oscar moved Londa into a sun-drenched cottage on the coast, a place where the sound of the waves replaced the ticking of the Sterling clocks. In this new life, the hierarchy of the past was dissolved. Oscar, the man who had been carried for decades, now became the one who ensured the tea was hot and the garden was watered. They spent their afternoons walking along the shoreline. Oscar moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his arm linked firmly with Londa's. Her back was still curved, and her steps were becoming shorter with age, but it didn't matter. In the Sterling world, walking had been a metric of perfection, a goal to be achieved for the sake of an image. But here, on the damp sand with the salt air in their lungs, they discovered a deeper truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, gentle gold over the water, Oscar slowed his pace to match hers perfectly. He didn't rush her and he didn't offer to carry her. He simply stayed by her side, a steady anchor in the evening light. They realized that the miracle wasn't the ability to move across the earth. It was having someone to move beside. In the home Oscar had built, walking was no longer a victory to be flaunted. It was a quiet, daily grace. They were finally standing together, and for the first time in 27 years, neither of them was a shadow.